Haven't a clue!
Well, it's that time of year once again, boys and ghouls. Halloween. Or in some circles, Gothic Christmas, where various pasty white leather-clad children of the night spend their time in a smoke-filled room exchanging accoutrements and paraphernalia found at Hot Topic. The rest of us normies dress up as childhood heroes or some kind of erotic spin on an otherwise terribly banal career uniform. You know, like the mature adults that we are. For me specifically, it means an excuse to revel in the spirit of the season through the medium of video games. And by revel, I mean put together a thematically appropriate video in the hopes that the YouTube algorithm spreads my content to the far reaches of the internet. Hooray! In all seriousness though, I love Halloween, and I love horror. So this is just the perfect time to talk about some of the horror games that I've been playing. And considering that Halloween should be a time for celebrating, I really want to do something a little bit different than a usual review or you should play of a horror game. This year, I'm reviving an old idea of mine back from the dead. I am doing my second Halloween Horror Extravaganza, a compilation video of not one, not two, but 4 different horror games that I played this year, and I think that any enthusiast of the eerie ought to check out. I actually tried making one of these way back in the early days of my channel, but unfortunately, nobody saw the video and it faded into obscurity. So, like a shambling corpse, I'm reanimating the idea and giving it another shot. Which is actually kind of thematically appropriate given the titles that I've lined up for you this year. After all, horror anthologies are a tried and true tradition of the season, so here's my take on it. So, sit back, grab yourself a beverage, and turn the lights down really low and enjoy Cult of the CyberSkull's Halloween Horror Extravaganza 2022. First up on our quadruplet of terrors is Nightmare of Decay, a first-person retro horror game by Checkmatey, which is, as far as I can tell, only the second game that the dev has ever made. This genuinely surprises me because Nightmare of Decay is actually really competently put together, which you wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at some of the game's screenshots. But do not be fooled by the game's PSX era looking graphics and assume that this is just another Unity asset flip or something, because Nightmare of Decay is anything but. Instead, what you're in for is a game that feels oddly familiar, but not in a cheap or hokey way. It takes the tried and true survival horror formula and reshapes it into, for all intents and purposes, a first-person shooter. Sure, it's still fairly slow-paced, and it doesn't give you an inventory that would make Duke Nukem blush or anything like that, but it does include mechanics that lean more towards giving the player some competent and comfortable shooting controls that are a fundamental pillar of gameplay. And you need those controls to be solid because as much as the game tries to make combat a bit more like an FPS, it still has the trappings of a proper survival horror game. Ammo and healing items are scarce and need to be rationed. Enemies will regularly surprise you, and being the bullet sponges that they are, don't go down easily. Headshots are key, but exploding brains don't always happen. Alternatively, you could always flee from your enemies, but only for a limited amount of time. If there are any enemies around you, a stamina meter appears on the screen and quickly drains as you exert yourself, exhausting you and forcing you to slow down to a crawl if you expend all the energy that you have. But that only happens if there's enemies nearby. If an area is clear, you can freely sprint about without any restrictions. And thankfully, rooms cleared of enemies remain that way throughout the entire game, meaning that risking a dip into your ammo stores to make backtracking a bit of an easier proposition is a perfectly common consideration that you may have while playing. As is the rule with all horror games, play it safely and smartly, lest you wind up in an untenable situation. Not unlike the game's developer, had they perhaps found their inspiration by being fans of Rockstar, or even worse, Nintendo.
No! God, please, no!
Yeah, if it isn't already obvious through the game footage that you're watching, Nightmare of Decay is pretty heavily inspired by Resident Evil. And by pretty inspired, I mean that the game isn't at all subtle about its source material. I mean, it does take the concept of being trapped in a mansion filled with zombies, wild dogs, evil cultists, reptilian mutants, giant spiders, and skeletons, and answers the age-old question of, what if we faced all these things, but like, from behind Chris Redfield's eyes? Except after Capcom already did it with Resident Evil 7. I'm being sarcastic, but hey, in all honesty, playing Nightmare of Decay really does feel like what it would be like to play the very first Resident Evil game from 1998 had it been developed as an FPS rather than a third-person game with set camera angles and tank controls. The mansion may not be as memorable, and the puzzles are a lot more simpler, but finding yourself trapped in this place that exists within a nightmare itself with a number of diverse areas to explore does lend itself to a surprisingly solid title, even if it can't help but constantly make references to horror games that have inspired it, or other media that genuinely made me laugh.
Jesus Christ!
As a result, the game is pretty light on spooks overall. The scant few humorous moments aside, the only sections that I found to be remotely tension-building were some of the boss fights, and that wasn't necessarily due to the atmosphere as much as it was due to the resource management and difficulty. The slow-moving, dim-witted zombies don't elicit fear, but their numbers can make you uneasy, which does count for something. And while I did do my best to preserve my ammo at all times, there were a few moments where I was worried about my ability to survive as my stores dwindled, though I never found myself empty or in truly dire straits. The game is also very short, clocking in at about a 2-hour runtime, give or take. However, that doesn't mean Nightmare of Decay is lacking for content. Beating the game on any difficulty mode unlocks 2 new game modes. The first is Horde mode. It's basically the Mercenaries mode found in most of the Resident Evil games. Buy your guns, survive waves of enemies, spend the money on resources, and last as long as you can. Straightforward enough. More interestingly, however, is the game's second mode, Dungeon Escape. This mode takes the basic gameplay of Nightmare of Decay and turns it into a straight-up roguelike, where your objective becomes escaping each floor of the dungeon that you find yourself in. You now have a mini-map that reveals the procedurally generated rooms as you explore them, you scavenge for items, and you get money that you can use to buy new gear between each floor. Furthermore, killing all the enemies on a floor before leaving nets you bonus cash, meaning that you can decide on how much of a risk you want to take as you wade through the dark and decrepit walls that will certainly become your tomb. These modes also include new enemies and unlockable weapons that aren't found in the main game. Finally, beating Nightmare of Decay on hard nets you a randomizer mode, which shuffles item and enemy placements and locations throughout the map. Definitely a point in the game's favor if that's something you're into. And I do hear that it's all the rage with the kids these days. What you get with Nightmare of Decay is an inexpensive indie game that pulls off delivering a sizable amount of content and doing it very well. For $5 on Steam, you get a very well put together survival horror game with plenty of side content. It's short, it's sweet, and it really scratches that Resident Evil itch from a whole new perspective. Speaking of Resident Evil-inspired games and their successors, Tormented Souls is what you get if you take the original Resident Evil formula and add modernizations to the gameplay, all while coating it with a dash of Silent Hill-esque psychological horror. But rather than being a cheap copy of either of those titles, Tormented Souls shows that you can go through great lengths to take the work laid out by your forebears and create something inspired, sleek, and downright creepy at times. Playing from the perspective of fixed camera angles and optional tank controls, Tormented Souls puts you in the shoes of Carolyn Walker, who, after receiving a mysterious letter from the Wildberger Hospital that gives her insomnia and horrid nightmares, decides that she needs to find out what's happening to her, so she goes right to the source. After being knocked out and having one of her eyes surgically removed, it's up to you to find out what connection you have to this place and to escape. But Tormented Souls is more than just a cheap homage. Rather, it takes those tried and true elements of old school survival horror games and brightens it up with a fresh coat of paint. It's very obvious that Tormented Souls takes its inspiration from Resident Evil. I already mentioned the fixed camera angles, which the game uses masterfully to establish an unsettling, intense setting. It often keeps monsters just outside of your line of sight, making you feel uneasy as you push further and further into the manor. This is especially true due to the game's excellent sound design. On top of haunting melodies for quieter moments and grating, tense, Silent Hill-esque pounding cacophonies during monster encounters and more run-down, decrepit, and haunting areas, the game likes to make the sounds of the monsters that you don't see echo throughout the hallways that you wander. The sounds are loud and often resemble the scraping of steel on concrete. And these sounds begin to pulse and pick up tempo when you enter combat. It's an especially effective way to further build tension and to make you worry about the very things that you know are up ahead, but you're just not sure of where they are or how many there are. All of this is even further enhanced by the game's lighting, which is fantastic. It uses a system wherein being caught in the dark is a death sentence. However, you're given a light source that you can carry to illuminate these dark areas. For the early and mid stages of the game, you'll be required to stay in lit areas if you propose to fight back against the beasties roaming the hospital, although some areas have these candled lamps that you can light with your lighter. This allows you to pull out a weapon and fight back, although you may still need to do some running and dodging to illuminate an area well enough before you make a stand. That's because your light source is equipped in your hands, and you can't carry it at the same time as you're holding a weapon. So the game looks good, it sounds great, and has a pretty interesting, if familiar, premise. However, the resemblance to Resident Evil only goes so far. Sure, its camera angles are a clear indication of its inspiration, as are the inventory system, and the fact that you need to find tapes and use them to save your data, as well as the layout of the hospital, and some somewhat perplexing puzzles that need solving in order to push deeper and deeper into the mansion. Hell, at one point Tormented Souls even incorporates its own version of Mr. X in the form of an invincible enemy that randomly spawns in hallways, though this one is much less frightening because it's much easier to lose them. If you enter a hallway and you hear its theme song playing, just exit the hallway and come back in. Rinse and repeat until they're gone. But that's not where it ends. The game has lots of Silent Hill thrown in too. For starters, the reliance of melee combat in the form of a crowbar feels strikingly familiar to Konami's once excellent horror franchise, even if the physics can be a little bit ridiculous at times. But even more poignant are the game's ruinous and decrepit alternate realities that strongly resemble Silent Hill's Otherworld. You even access these areas by stepping through mirrors. I'll also say that they're rather cleverly used to set up some really interesting puzzles and add an extra layer of horror to the game, which I very much appreciate. And that all goes without mentioning the horrific imagery and the psychological terrors that you find in these areas and what these images represent. But Tormented Souls takes this even a step further by sprucing up the gameplay into something sleek and modern. For example, the game has tank controls, but they're optional. By default, moving the stick will have you running in a familiar camera-oriented manner, but you could alternatively use the D-pad and manually hold your X button to run if you want. More importantly, pressing X during combat will allow Caroline to dodge attacks, giving you a window to reload your weapon or just to avoid damage altogether. It's quite the lifesaver, both figuratively and literally. There are a couple of environmental traps, but you can actually use these to kill monsters on occasion, which is also really neat. And even something like interacting with puzzles by moving an on-screen cursor to interact with the specific segments of the puzzle or the object that you're holding is a lot more interesting than just placing one object onto another. It gives everything a much more tactile feel, which again is something I appreciate, even if some puzzles are a bit tricky to pull off with this method. Speaking of the puzzles, I found them to be satisfyingly complex. I don't think they're quite as obtuse as a latter entry in this video, but they nevertheless required some level of mental application to correctly solve. Some require you to find and combine certain items to progress, others require you to find clues and use the correct inputs, and some are just dastardly bastards and really require you to stretch your brain a little bit. They don't exactly use moon logic, but it's really easy to miss the clues that the game gives you, and the hints are pretty obscure, but they're not insurmountable, that's the important part. And they do constitute a portion of the game whose absence would be sorely missed. Dare I say, even cheapen the old school experience a bit, which is exactly what this game is trying to emulate. All in all, Tormented Souls is an excellent spiritual successor, though I do think the character models can be a bit jarring due to their rather doll-like appearance, and I do have some issues with some of the game's plot, writing, and setup. It's overall a tightly told horror story that works extremely well for what it is, and it's fantastic to play. The mostly optional journal entries that can be found scattered across the game, if collected, do a great job of giving you the full picture of the events that transpired in the Wildberger Hospital from different perspectives, both past and present. But none of that is enough for me to say that Tormented Souls is anything less than fantastic. What you get with this game is an indie studio putting out the same quality of horror games that AAAs did back 10-15 years ago, and I don't mean that as an insult at all. Tormented Souls is a truly modern interpretation of a classic survival horror game, and it executes that idea incredibly well. The systems are updated to be on par with modern expectations without sacrificing the essence of what fans of old-school survival horror games enjoy seeing in them, and if you're a fan of such titles, you would be remiss not to give Tormented Souls a try. It's one of the best of its kind. For our third entry this year, we turn to the horror of Salazar House. It's yet another retro-inspired title, as is befitting our theme thus far. However, this one draws its influence from Italian horror and, of all things, the Virtual Boy. It's a 1-bit first-person adventure game with rotoscoped cutscenes and a context-sensitive single-color overlay that, while it claims to have Virtual Boy graphics, reminds me more of the old Mac Venture game series than anything else. Well, perhaps except for Innsmouth no Yakata, but that's a topic for an entirely other video. The horror of Salazar House is actually the debut game from the Chilean developer Ignacio Maldonado, otherwise known as Maldo 19. It was originally released on itch.io as the Enigma of Salazar House, before being re-released on Steam with some additional content and a name change to the Horror of Salazar House. True to its word, the game takes you through the corridors of the titular house investigating the disappearance of a local family, and working to undermine and reverse the effects of a lingering ritual that has cursed them. Taking the reins of an investigative journalist, Eliza Munoz, you guide her expedition through a fairly expansive yet well-constrained single-floor house while avoiding a murderous ghost and unraveling the truth of what has happened here. What strikes me about Salazar House is just how tight the experience is. The setup works just great for what the game is aiming to achieve, and by restricting the size of the house to a single floor, it manages to establish a steady pace that keeps the game progressing at just the right tempo. The random appearances of the ghost that chases you adds to this very nicely. The ghost is programmed to appear at random every time you move into a new area, as indicated by the change of the game's colors to a deep red and black. This signals that the ghost has spawned, even if you haven't seen her yet. To survive, you need to move into the nearest hiding spot, any space with a chest or a dresser, and climb in. Doing so gives you a narrow slit that you can see through. If you catch sight of the ghost, you need to close the lid until she goes away. But be wary. She can smell your fear, and this builds the longer that you're hidden away. The game's color palette is a great touch, with the monotones differentiating the mood of each area very well. Dark rooms will be blue, safe rooms are yellow, rooms with threats or times of rising tension will be red, and the blood red and black screens tell you that you're in imminent danger. It makes the monochromatic scenes a lot more vibrant and varied, and it's an immediate indication of your surroundings without having to rely on long text dumps describing them. When not being chased, you wander around the house solving a handful of puzzles in an attempt to put the souls of the house's victims at ease. Naturally, this is done through a series of item puzzles that has you going into rooms and interacting with objects until you can figure out how they go with each other. These puzzles aren't too complex, but you're going to need to apply yourself a little bit and use some logic to figure them out. If you're stuck, you get an item early on that gives you hints and outlines about your objectives, albeit in a bit of a cryptic way that still forces you to think a little bit. Once these puzzles are solved, the text in the book changes, giving you a few clues into understanding what has transpired, but still leaving plenty of room for interpretation. The developer here truly understands that with horror, less is often more, and it's a great way of highlighting the tragedy of the Salazar family. As far as scares go, the game does a surprisingly good job of making a single-floor house with a stalking ghost a spooky experience. Obviously the visuals go a long way here, with beautifully drawn sprites and animations that can still be very unsettling at times. These are especially ghastly during some of the death animations, which almost always happen after springing a trap, not to mention the shrill wails of the ghost every time she catches up to you. The Steam version of the game includes a short prequel chapter that acts as both a setup for the game's plot and a crash course to learn the game's basic mechanics, as well as a new default difficulty mode that makes the game more balanced in terms of how hard it is. The original difficulty has still been left intact though, so play that if that's more your speed. To top it all off, the game does have multiple endings, including 3 brand new ones in the updated version, which gives you even more incentive to explore every bit of the house that you can. Once you've seen them all, you get a few secret notes from the developer that really show that he poured his heart and soul into this project. The end result is a perfectly paced game that doesn't overstay its welcome, and it's a simple but yet very effective little horror game well worth playing. Especially if you're a fan of the adventure variety, rather than the more survival horror route. It doesn't take more than an hour or so to finish, and it delves out its scares in a very satisfying manner. Not bad for a 1-bit retro adventure game. And speaking of satisfying, I don't think any horror game has resonated with me quite like Visage has, our 4th and final title in this year's Halloween Horror Extravaganza. I first played Visage all the way back in February of this year, and I immediately found myself enthralled by it. From start to finish, Visage worms its way into your head and submerges you in some of the most oppressive and unnerving atmospheres that I've ever seen in a horror game. I did not for a single moment feel safe during the entirety of my playthrough, so much so that I ended up having to play the game in bursts just to be able to get through it. In fact, I didn't even want to replay it for this video, and I don't say that lightly. I've played my fair share of horror games, and I'm a big fan of the genre, so I'd like to think that I've got a fairly high tolerance for them. But there's something about Visage's brand of horror that is so disturbing and anxiety-inducing that I need to steel myself just to wander around the house for a bit. So it's thanks to some footage generously given to me by some very awesome content creators. Seriously, go watch their stuff, they do some amazing work. Links are in the description below. That I'm able to talk about Visage and why I think that, as far as PT clones go, Visage is demanding and challenging enough to deliver an extremely good horror game experience. But that being said, being a PT clone, Visage's presentation is pretty much what you already may expect. It's a purely first-person game wherein you play as a man, Dwayne Anderson, wandering inside of a house and dealing with the various hauntings that occur there. There are 3 exclusive, isolated chapters. Each one focuses on one of the former residents of the house, with a much more open 4th-ended chapter that gives you some insight into the silent protagonist and the demons that he himself faces. These chapters are started by interacting with certain objects associated with the characters in question. This then opens up different areas of the house, allowing you to begin your descent into the depths of these people's psyches and unraveling their tragic ends. While these chapters are isolated, they do allow for more areas of the house to be opened up and further explored as the game progresses, something that is vital in order to complete the series of puzzles that makes up the game's 4th chapter. But starting one of these 3 paths locks you into it, meaning that short of loading a previous save, you're stuck in that chapter until it's completed. Each of these chapters is rooted in a particular theme that draws upon the personal horrors of the subject that they're centered around. The common thread between them all, and including that of Dwayne, is that they're all dwellers of the house, and in some shape or form, they've all fallen victim to it. And because of that, the environment is somewhat built to accommodate this, requiring you to track and backtrack your way throughout the house in order to solve the puzzles and reach certain checkpoints in order to get to the end, where you can then witness what gruesome fate befell all of these poor souls. And this is the aspect where Visage truly excels. It knows just how to terrify you. Not only are the chapters you're playing chock full of disturbing imagery and scary environments, but the house itself is built to frighten you even during the moments that would normally be used to lower one's anxiety. The house will randomly create spooks and scares as you wander about, and when the environment feels as oppressive as it does in Visage, the simple act of a TV set turning on or off unprompted or a light bulb bursting is enough to cause a jolt. That, combined with how it uses darkness, not just as a mechanism to create fear, but also the way it ties into the game's sanity mechanic, which, if it drops too low from standing around in said darkness, will lead to player death. Suddenly, those lights burning out becomes a big deal, prompting you to find new light bulbs to replace them. In fact, all of the light sources in the game are limited, which means you're constantly looking around to replace them when they run out. Lighters run out of fuel, candles burn out after some time, and light bulbs can burst and shatter. And on top of all of this, the game will begin randomly spawning the angry phantoms that will chase you down and murder you as you go through each of their respective chapters. The fact that you see it happen in the first person makes it chilling, and the fact that you don't know when they will appear and chase you down puts you on the edge of your seat. But there's also a surreal aspect to the game, as each of the chapters takes you down the hallways of otherworldly places that have touched each of the characters in tow. Again, silent protagonists included. These sequences briefly take you outside of the house and into other locations that are meaningful to the chapter's central figure, and these are meant not only to freshen up the experience and give you a change of scenery, but also to give you some more insight into what befell these characters in the first place. What surprises me about Visage, however, is that it isn't quite as universally loved as I may have thought. I can understand criticism for it, but personally, I think it's a damn fine game. That being said, it does have its share of detractors, and for good reason. Case in point, my friend High Functioning Medium here has this to say about the game.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank CyberSkull for giving me the opportunity to chime in here. This should be short and sour. Visage is the perfect example of the road to hell being paved with good intentions. I heard great things about this being the worthy successor to PT and noted that it was a good length too, so it seemed like the developers were really going all out to make this a full and deep experience. Its unrelenting commitment to being the definitive hardcore horror puzzler, though, makes it a love or hate it type of experience, as there's no 30 seconds of fun gameplay gameplay loop to fall back on. Excellent scares and atmosphere are here, but you have to tread through endlessly vague and tedious scenarios over and over to get to them. But let's dwell on what I responded to in Visage first. Jump scares aren't prevalent, but they are well timed and effective. You'll see some generic ones, like a twitching apparition with his back to you at the end of a hallway, but I almost lost my mind when I was walking through a well-lit bedroom to get to the main hallway, only to stop dead in my tracks because someone was quietly peering around the corner, their fingers gripping the wall edge before sliding back out of sight. How could that be so jarring? Well, play the game and find out, and yes, I'll help pay the hospital bill from the ensuing heart attack, as it was my recommendation. The Visage does these things so well as satisfying because it's what I expected from the game based on its production values, length, and general reputation. But where Visage begins to grate was its insistence on downright inhospitable design choices like pointlessly restrictive inventory mechanics, sanity meters, backtracking, and completely arbitrary puzzle solutions. Visage admittedly does warn you in its opening screens that it's a very difficult game, but Visage isn't testing your reflexes and ingenuity, but your patience and credulity. For instance, at one point you'll hear a noise from the attic and you'll want to go investigate, but you can't reach the attic door without help. I'd searched the house high and low up to this point and hadn't seen anything that would qualify as such save for a box and hangers in a closet, and I thought these would make the perfect elevation to get higher and then allow me to pull down the little loop handle on the attic door and progress. But no, my intuitive reading of the game's seemingly bespoke elements was not what the devs had in mind. Instead, I needed to have known to go to a specific room in the house and wait for at least 5 seconds for a ghost to then spawn in the least likely place I was ever going to look, all the way back near the place where I'd started the game off. This ghost eventually leads you back to where a hook has spawned, so you can then travel all the way across the house again to pull the attic down with it. Now this example is a microcosm of what Visage does time and time again. It assumes the player has some Gnostic insight into the developer's design notes and fails to reward playing along with the assets and ideas that are expressly present in the game. No matter what items I found, it never quite followed how I was to use them beyond, keys interacting with doors. Not to mention how one chapter has you smashing mirrors so you can enter little pocket worlds with puzzles behind them, but it spreads all these throughout the house and has a necessary order that each must be completed in, because each reward item inside must then be used to progress in another puzzle room, like a never-ending street that you must acquire a compass for in order to traverse, but you must first find the crowbar to unlock the window that's in front of the compass, and so on. You could conceivably do them all in the most convenient order, but it's just a matter of luck to do so and not very likely. And it's not like rooms are in close proximity to one another, so they kind of feed off of each other in a chain before moving on to the next set. Treks across the house are definitely required. Another puzzle even wants you to do some variation of look at all these mirrors over and over and know in the very last one you need to walk away about 5 paces, turn around and face the completely inky blackness around you, then come back and wait for a while until something appears in that exact mirror. There's such a random push and pull between throwing you in the deep end without giving you a good idea of what you'd want to do or what's even possible, to the opposite problem where puzzles require very prescriptive sets of steps to complete. It's this constant presumptiveness and pushiness that put me off, this disregard for the player that in no way asks fun questions of one's intellect but tests a tolerance for tedium, as if the game wasn't trying to break your brain enough. Some areas even actively try to trap you in bad faith, mean-spirited ways. One area puts you in complete darkness, even with the brightness fully turned up, so that you can't see and slowly go insane, hoping to bump your way out of a very tight area and up some stairs to make it back to a light source. The best part? The pills that would save your sanity long enough to get you through all this are all upstairs in completely lit places that you never need them in, so you'd have no reason to pick them up. Not to mention, to get down to this area, and many others like it, you're going to want to bring required items like tools that allow progress forward, not random power-ups on the off chance you might need them later. Oh, and why can't I just put the pills in my inventory and come down into the darkness with no fear? Because only keys and candles and cassette tapes can be carried with you indefinitely. Lighters, pills, and tools like the sledgehammer have to be carried in your 2-slot hands inventory and dropped if you need to pick up something else. In the sledgehammer's case, which took up both hand slots to carry, I had to bring it with me to progress, but in the midst of this trek, I got stuck in this scripted pitch black area that we just mentioned, with nothing to light the candles with and save off insanity because either there were no light sources to use, or the lighters I'd had earlier had been put down to pick up the hammer in the first place. Better yet, once lighters get put down, they're gone for good, even if they had fuel left over when you discarded them, so you can't just pick them up and make a quick swap as needed.
Just to interject here briefly. In Visage, your inventory is broken up into 2 categories, key items and dynamic items. Key items are exactly what you expect, while dynamic items are your finite resources. You can store up to 5 of these items in your inventory and carry 2 more, one in each hand. The problem here is that the UI doesn't indicate the ability to store items unless you already have your inventory open, and the tutorial pop-up for this isn't very informative beyond a simple description of how the system works. If anything, it probably just goes to show that the game's vagueness can trip players up unnecessarily, and given as to how difficult the game already is, this makes it feel even more punishing. But I digress, back to the medium.
This is just awful design, and a much worse version of the light and dark mechanics from Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which this game cribs a lot from. At least that game gave you an interesting dilemma of whether to use your limited supply of matches now to light up an area and preserve sanity, or try and make a long run of it in the dark and preserve your resources for later. Amnesia also had the trade-off that light made it easier for monsters to see you, so sometimes you had to risk your sanity and hide in dark corners to avoid detection. Visage misses the point of this mechanic entirely, and makes you trade back and forth, carrying small amounts of crap just to inch forward in the area you're stuck in the first place. Certain parts of the house also get blocked off, and yet walkthroughs confirm that you have to access them in order to get out of the scripted state of the house you're in. Good grief. That's a poor way to do. Visage just bullies the player instead of challenging them too often, and even at its best, it's often so slow in plotting and aimless in its design. Getting lucky and figuring out its obtuse ways forward isn't rewarding because the tension is non-existent, and it doesn't make you feel smart because this type of arbitrary design doesn't follow patterns or encourage intuition. Now, I won't come to your house and harass you if you like Visage. Hell, if you love it for exactly these reasons that I didn't like it. But Visage's extremes are clear and present dangers to enjoyment on a far too regular basis for me to be able to recommend it, and so I must warn you away from it if you'd rather not feel that the game is playing you and not the other way around.
As cryptic as the puzzle sequences may be, I think they're far from unsolvable, and their explicit design is to make you track and backtrack, which serves to force you to experience the atmosphere and the environments that you find yourself in and be overwhelmed by them. I do admit, however, that the game could have exhibited some restraint with this during some of its sequences. In Dolores' chapter, for example, there's an entire sequence which has you jumping through mirrors to experience parts of her memory, with puzzles inside that require you to use items from other mirrors, which requires you to smash them with a two-handed item, which you can't put in your inventory and may require you to backtrack to the basement of the house to retrieve from storage in case you ever lose it. From a purely gameplay perspective, this is very tedious and frustrating. But, from a psychological horror perspective, this proposition is downright terrifying. The amount of time spent in that house dealing with random scares and worrying about the batteries in my flashlight dying and hoping to not run into Dolores the ghost while I wander around in the darkness was more than enough to make me stretch out that sequence well over a week. And all of this makes me appreciate what Visage tries to accomplish all the more. Is the game perfect? Absolutely not. It's not very well optimized, it's extremely challenging to the point where it doesn't care if you find yourself in an unwinnable situation, and it revels in sometimes making you pull your hair out trying to figure out exactly what you need to do. But I feel that the game's strengths, namely the way it builds atmosphere, the way it elicits fear, and the way it drags you through the darkness to deliver a horror story that is utterly terrifying, more than outweigh its issues. On that note, I cannot recommend Visage enough, even if some other YouTubers who know their horror gaming a fair bit better than I do disagree with me. But whether or not that's enough to deter you from trying out Visage is ultimately up to you, or any of the other titles that we've taken a look at this year. Each of them approaches horror gaming in a unique way, all while emulating titles from the past and adapting them in their own unique ways. At the end of the day, each of them gives you a different way to enjoy the creeping chills and spooky scares that the season is all about. So I'd say check them out during this year's inevitable Halloween sale at your game retailer of choice. I don't think any of them will be leaving you disappointed. What other horror games will I exhume from the depths in the future? You're just going to have to find out by tuning in to the next Halloween Horror Extravaganza to find out, whenever I decide to do another one of these. But until then, happy Halloween everybody, stay safe, and thank you so much for watching.